Hi there, greetings from the airport. So speaking of airport and wearing masks in order to fly inside airport, kind of reminds us of the olfactory system in our noses and sort of how we can smell as well, sort of waiting out here for the plane. Right, so I kind of wanted to, you can see it's COVID time, so I'm wearing my mask right now. Kind of what I want to show you guys is this example here about how our olfactory system works and how we can sort of use that to advance artificial intelligence and vice versa, just as another example. So, and without further ado, you can see that I'm wearing a mask. Have it off for 1 second, but I'm wearing my mask around my nose. Okay, at the airport. But what can I smell, right? So in the theme of olfactory, I'm going to share this article with you guys. So this is within neuroscience, and this is the AI branch, okay? So artificial intelligence in articles involve programming, neural engineering, artificial neural networks, artificial life, A-life, Floyd's, Boyd's, emergence, machine learning, neural bots, neural robotics, computational neuroscience, and more involving AI research. So I kind of just want to show you that there's this research that's out there about a new machine learning algorithm. So you see the date, so it's very cutting edge, and the article is called Artificial Networks Learn to Smell Like the Brain, like the olfactory system. So that's the theme of this mask wearing today. So a new machine learning algorithm is able to teach itself to smell within a few minutes of training. As it learns, the system builds an artificial network that mimics the brain's olfactory system. So it's a machine learning algorithm that is using artificial intelligence, and it's trying to teach itself to smell within a few minutes of training. And the process of learning how to build this artificial network is mimicking that of the brain's olfactory system. So if you're trying to build a classifier for smelling detector, essentially, if you're trying to build out an AI in a way that's sort of based on how the brain neurons are firing, you're essentially trying to mimic how our olfactory system and our brain that is sort of controlling our sense of smell is working. So using machine learning, a computer model can teach itself to smell in just a few minutes. When it does, researchers have found, it builds a neural network. This is an artificial neural network that closely mimics the olfactory circuits the animal brains use to process odors. So that is really cool. So animals, from fruit flies to humans, all use essentially the same strategy to process olfactory information in the brain. The neuroscientists who trained an artificial neural network to take on a simple odor classification task. So the artificial neural network is trying to take on a simple odor classification task. We take some smell and try to classify it, using a deep learning method, like neural networks. So they were actually able to replicate biology strategy so faithfully. So essentially the machine learning model learned about odor in the process of learning odor classification and how to fire neurons to predict odors correctly. They sort of learned something about how our olfactory system works in our brain, which is pretty incredible. So I'm going to be flying, but I will continue this. So I want to continue talking to you about how artificial neural networks, they can learn to smell like the brain. How does our brain smell? What are all these smells about? And how can an artificial
neural network essentially learn these skills, right? So olfactory senses, like how we can smell. So basically the core idea that I was talking about is that, you know, there are different types of neural networks out there that try to do all sorts of tasks. And when we can come up with an artificial neural network to come up with a simple odor classification task, you know, what takes it in smells and figure out what those correspond to. They were surprised that by using deep learning, which is based on models of how our brain functions, they were able to see it replicate biology strategies so faithfully. So the similarities between the artificial and biological systems. So the artificial is when we come up with a computational model to figure out how to classify certain tasks, how to come up with a way to take this data and figure out the smells. And that's what's artificial. It's using computational models. And there's a similarity between that and actual biological systems, the way that our nose smells. So that means that our brain's olfactory network is optimally suited to its task. They say that the artificial network will help researchers learn more about the brain's olfactory circuits. So in the process, when they came up with this artificial neural network, it's really similar to how our brain, how our olfactory system works. So on October 6th, they reported their findings in the journal Neurons. And they say that the artificial network will help researchers learn more about the brain's olfactory circuits. And it also shows how artificial neural networks can be really relevant to neuroscience. By showing that we can match the architecture of the biological system very precisely, I think that it gives more confidence that these neural networks can continue to be useful tools for modeling the brain, says Yang, an assistant professor in MIT's Department of Brain and Cognitive Sciences and Electric and Computer Science. So how do we map natural olfactory circuits? So let's talk about what this paper was mentioning here. So the organism in which the brain's olfactory circuitry has been best mapped are fruit flies, and the smell begins in the antenna. So I'll just show you the fruit fly. This is a little fruit fly right here. You know, they have their antennas. So sensory neurons, they're each equipped with the odor receptors specialized to detect specific scents, transform the binding of odor molecules into electrical activity. So there are different types of neurons, and then there are sensory neurons that take in all the sensory input. And I have another video where I talk about the three main types of neurons. But we have the sensory neurons. The sensory neurons take in this input. You know, they're nerve cells, types of neurons that are activated by sensory input from the environment. If you touch a hot surface with your fingertips, the sensory neurons will be the ones firing and sending off signals to the rest of the nervous system about the information that they have received. So basically, these neurons, they have odor receptors and they detect specific scents, turn the odor molecules into electrical activity, like action potential is being fired. So when an odor is detected, these neurons, which make up the first layer of the olfactory network, signal to the second layer, a set of neurons that reside in a part of the brain called the antennal lobe. And the antennal lobe and sensory neurons that share the same receptor converge onto the same second layer neuron. So, you know, when an odor is detected, these neurons, that are the sensory neurons, they then fire a signal to the second layer, which is in the antennal lobe. So we have the sensory neurons that are in, kind of receiving the scent and the signals. And when they receive that, then they kind of, signal to the second layer neurons that are the antennal lobe neurons. And they're very choosy, Yang says. They don't receive any input from neurons expressing other receptors. Because there's fewer neurons in the first layer, this part of the network is considered a compression layer. And the second layer neurons in turn signal to a larger set of neurons in the third layer. And these connections appear to be random. So that's what we have to understand better, that like, how are these connections made? So a few parts of the brain have been mapped as comprehensively, and that has made it even difficult to evaluate how well certain computational models represent the true architecture of neural circuits, they say. So this is sort of how the olfactory system kind of works in fruit flies. So this is sort of how, a little bit of like what it looks like here. You know, you have these antennae, you have these behavioral outputs, you know. So it's sort of how the signaling takes place inside, you know, these fruit flies. And we're trying to figure out how, you know, head of a fruit fly and the antenna. And we have like these dendrites, and we've got the axons here, you know, in this antenna of a fruit fly that's jutting out here. So the idea is that what we wanted to do is figure out how to come up with a sense of smell, you know. Artificial, so digital olfaction, it mimics the way humans smell by capturing odor signatures using biosensors, then using software solutions to analyze and display the odor data. Artificial intelligence interprets the signatures and classifies them based on a database of previously collected smells. So in this article that's about like 6 months old, they talk about how artificial intelligence is developing a sense of smell. You know, so we already know we can teach machines. So that was sort of this article here. And this is an MIT News, and it's saying that artificial networks learn to smell like the brain. When asked to classify odors, they adopt basically a system that looks pretty much very similar to how our brain olfactory system works, which sort of shows us that our brain is pretty optimal when it comes to that. So using machine learning, a computer model can teach itself to smell in just a few minutes. When it does, it builds a neural network that closely mimics the olfactory circuits that animal brains use to process odors. So this is the article here that we were looking at. And there are even AIs out there, like neural networks out there that, you know, can mimic how, you know, our sense of smell. Our remarkable olfactory senses are modeled in a new research chip. So this is all like artificial, like, can we teach something to smell? And my parents, when they were growing up, they sort of thought, if you said that you one day, you could see the person that you're talking to on a phone, like sort of how we do video calls, they will have said that that is not really possible. That's so odd. Like, why would you be able to see the person? But here we are today, and we can have video calls, you know, we can see the person on the other end. But what if we could like smell them? You know, what if you're wearing a nice scent and I can share this nice little lotion that I'm wearing with all of you digitally? So you might think it's crazy, but that's sort of how the best ideas develop. And now they have this new AI that, you know, was about 1.5 years ago that passes the smell test almost 100% of the time. So 2 researchers have created an algorithm that can accurately identify 10 different smells. It runs on an Intel chip that has 130,000 silicon neurons. These are artificial neurons that are sort of based on how our brain signals. And the natural mammalian olfactory bulb grows new neurons even in adults. Our noses are busy beats. At any given moment, multiple smells are competing for our attention. And somehow the brain can tell when it's smelling an orange, even against a backdrop of other scents, say perfume or soap. The brain's olfactory bulb has hundreds of receptors tracking odors all the time, and yet somehow keeps everything straight. A scientist at Cornell working with a researcher at Intel has just created an AI algorithm to recognize 10 scents by mimicking the mammalian olfactory bulb. So they're trying to figure out how our nose works and then come up with an AI algorithm that is sort of trying to figure out how the brain is signaling. Can we use that knowledge to, kind of mimic the nose system, the olfactory system? So give the algorithm a computer chip to run on, and it can learn to identify new odors. So it's simulating the brain basically to recognize 10 different odors, and it's based on biology, like how the neurons are signaling and firing with each other. That's what like artificial intelligence, deep learning, artificial neural networks are based on the biology of the brain. But what they're trying to do is they're trying to figure out, they studied olfactory bulb circuits in rodents, trying to figure out essentially how it works with an eye towards things that we know animals can do that our machines can't. There's neuromorphic computing inspired by the brain, sporting some 130,000 silicon neurons. Like our own neurons, each of these artificial neurons can fire independently of the others, sending pulse signals to its neighbors, changing the electrical states. It can accept inputs from a variety of physical sensors, such as metal oxide chemical sensors that Keelan and Imam used, allowing the entire structure to simulate the natural learning process that naturally occurs when the mammalian brain is fed various sensory inputs. So this is sort of like, these are neurons, and this is like a smell of a nice rose, and this is the neural networks, right? So in the mammalian olfactory brain, or olfactory bulb, there are a couple of important neuron types, mitral cells that switch on. So that even within neurons, there are multiple different types of those neurons that we can learn about. There's the mitral, mitral neurons as well. A cell in the olfactory bulb that carries olfactory information. So if we see olfactory information, olfactory is a sense of smell. So this is what gives us our sense of smell here. Lamina propria, olfactory epithelium, basal cell, supporting cell, cilia, other molecules here. For our sense of smell here. Nasal cavity, olfactory bulb here. All these neurons here in our nose that help give us that sense of smell. So it's a cell in the olfactory bulb. It carries olfactory information from the olfactory bulb to the rest of the brain for processing. So it carries the information from the olfactory bulb to the rest of the brain, like the olfactory cortex, for processing. You can sort of see here, fibers, mitral cells, olfactory epithelium, glomeruli. You can see all of this information here. So if we are receiving, so the way that it sort of works is that if we're receiving basically like any stimulus here, like a sense of smell of a rose, rose has some odor molecules, and then they sort of are inhaled up. This is our nose here. This is our, human being. They're inhaled up, and then we have receptor cells in the olfactory membrane. And then this is the olfactory bulb here. And this is the olfactory nerve. And then we can just zoom in on sort of what's happening here, right? So all these odor molecules here, so air with odorant molecules, these are the same odor molecules here. This is the same thing as here. And so the natural air has these odor molecules here, and these odorants, they bind to these receptors. They have these odorant receptors here. So if we zoom in on what's going on over here, right, we can see that there are these odors that are binding here. And olfactory receptor cells are activated and send electrical signals here. So these are neurons, they have the dendrites that receive the information, pass it along as well. And then the signals are relayed via converged axons here. And the signals are transmitted to higher regions of the brain, like the olfactory bulb up here. And that's sort of like how the sense of smell, it's so complex, and I might not fully understand either, but it's just stuff that is responsible for how we can smell. So the researchers have trained the algorithm to identify 10 chemical smells: acetone, acetaldehyde, ammonia, butanol, ethylene, methane, methanol, carbon monoxide, benzene, and toluene. The idea is that in the presence of an odor, it verifies the sense presence, and patterns of firing neurons identify exactly which smell it is. So the patterns of firing neurons is very similar to like how our brain works in artificial, in the real brain works, but that's what the artificial intelligence is learning here. So over the course of 5 cycles of exposure to each odor, the AI was eventually able to associate specific neural firing patterns with specific smells. It correctly identified 8 of the smells 100% of the time, and the remaining 2 with 90% accuracy. And in my book, that is a pretty awesome achievement to be able to classify those types of smells so well. Additional simulations are run in which the target odor was masked 80% by other smells, the way they'd often be in the real world, and accuracy dropped down to just 30%. So they're still pretty impressive for such a young AI. So these things are still developing, right? But so there's not exactly as accurate, but they're trying to figure it out. And that was about 1.5 years ago. So coming back to this original article, we're trying to answer this question. Can artificial neural networks truly be used to study the brain? So it's sort of like a, not a vicious cycle, but it's similar to that, but in a good way. So it's not vicious, but the idea is like in a vicious cycle of poverty, the poorer you are, the less resources you have access to, and the less opportunities you have, and then you stay stuck there in poverty for generations and generations, and poverty, and like less education, early pregnancies, all those things happen. It's a vicious cycle of poverty is what they say. But in this case, I want to say it's like a similar idea, but it's a positive thing that, we can use artificial intelligence to build the, to better understand the human brain. But the first idea is we wanted to see, can we develop an artificial neural network that can help us figure out certain smells? Imagine if you can have these sensors that can detect, in your garage, if you have carbon monoxide, if you have the car on, or this certain presence of these gases, in the car, you left the stove on and there's too much buildup of gas and it's highly flammable. Can we figure out smells? Can we try to classify things? I think maybe it's an odorless smell, but in any case, can you try to classify certain smells and figure those things out? Can you come up with an AI to do that? And when you do that, then that has a lot of applications, like sort of the things like what I was saying. But once you finish doing that too, not only do you have an AI that can help you with those tasks, but if you can figure out how that AI works, you could also try to figure out like, hey, this AI does so well at classifying smells. Is this sort of how our mind, our brain is learning how to smell? Can we also then use this AI to help us again understand how our brain works better? So connections would be rewired as the model learned to classify odors. And that's what the question is. So it took the artificial neural network only minutes to organize itself. The structure that emerged was similar, structurally, stunningly similar to that found in the fruit fly brain. Each neuron and the compression layer received input from a particular type of input neuron and connected seemingly randomly to multiple neurons in the expansion layer. They receive connections on average from 6 compression layer neurons, exactly as occurs in the fruit fly brain. So this AI kind of helped you not only classify smells well, but it kind of figured out some really cool things about how the fruit fly brain wires, and it's stunningly similar. So that means that, the AI could eventually maybe be used to help us learn about certain things, that how our brain works. Not only can we make an AI to help accomplish tasks, but we can also use it as one of the ways. Eeks, You can use it as one of the ways to learn about the brain as well. So it's something really cool. If you combine the scent of two different apples, the brain still smells apple. In contrast, if two photographs of cats are blended pixel by pixel, the brain no longer sees a cat. This ability is just one feature of the brain's odor processing circuits, but captures the essence of the system. So we need to be able to train it such that, you know, if you have two apples side by side, it's going to recognize that, hey, they're apples, but, you know, they're different apples, but it's not going to, you know, combine them or confuse them. Like if you just juxtapose two images of a cat, you might not recognize the cat anymore. It could have been biology find 6 and our network find 6. So, you know, there are 6 compression layer neurons that it found. And, you know, it could have been 1, it could have been 50, it could have been anywhere in between. Biology finds 6 neurons. Each neuron is connected on average from 6 compression layer neurons. So evolution found this organization through natural selection and random mutation for the fruit fly's brain sense of smell. They found that number 6. And this artificial network found it through standard machine learning algorithms. So there is remarkable similarity between both the AI and the fruit fly brain in terms of how they have a sense of smell. So it shows that the brain circuits that interpret the olfactory information are optimally organized for their tasks. So what is really cool is that if the AI that we came up with to classify smells also is using some very similar structures as how the fruit fly brain, you know, is working for the sense of smell, then it means that the brain circuits are optimal for their tasks. So researchers can use the model to further explore the structure, exploring how the network evolves under different conditions and manipulate that circuitry in ways that cannot be done experimentally. So this is really cool. And this was just published in Cell, which is a very, very good paper. So what the highlights of this paper are, is that, you know, the network has pathways for learned and innate odor classification. Input units, they form a glomerulus, and neural networks, the artificial trained to classify odors, match the olfactory system connectivity. So that is something that is really cool, you know, and I just wanted to share that with you guys because I know that, you know, you might wonder, artificial intelligence can be used to help us out, but it can also be a really key thing in helping us, you know, figure out how the brain works as well. So we can use, and then we can feed onto that more. So sometimes we build an AI, artificial intelligence, deep learning neural network based on what we understand about a sense of smell, which is sort of what I've shown in other videos, that we can use the model of the brain to help us build AIs. But you know, use that or build, you know, deep learning artificial intelligence neural network. So we can use what we understand about the brain and also different cell types to build our artificial intelligence deep learning neural networks, you know, based on the biology of the brain. You can use those. So what we can do is we can use all those things out there. Let me show you. We can kind of go on and use these to build an artificial network to come up with classification of things, you know. We can have an input, feature extraction, and classification can be done as well. And the idea is really, really key that, and you know, so a brain neuron, dendrites are the input. So these are the dendrites, they're the input structure, and the soma, the cell body, does calculation processes, and the axon, you know, the cell body is a soma, and it does calculations, and if it has enough, it hits an action potential is fired, which is an electrical signal that spreads along the axons. And in an artificial neural network, you know, the incoming connection receives input. So that's how the dendrites are. They are receiving inputs. And the soma that's used for calculation processes that, you know, gathers all the signal, you know, from inhibitory neurons that try to prevent the action potential, and excitatory neurons that try to send and promote the signal, fire and action potential. So the activation function is similarly, it's trying to make a non-linear decision. Should it fire, should it not? And the output connection, where the signal spreads along the neuron in biology, in the artificial network, it delivers the activation signal if one is fired. And I know that was kind of fast, but I just want to show you that, you can use this to do a lot of tasks. Like this is a cat, this is a dog, you might have an image and you want to figure those things out, or you might have some data and you want to make some classifications or some predictions. And so we focus on, there's machine learning, but within that we have a branch called deep learning. And deep learning has feature extraction and classification, and it's really, really based on the model of the human brain. So that is really cool. We have inputs, and then we have these neurons. So you can think of these as like neurons. And then we can have many hidden layers here. And then we have an output layer. And it's sort of based on how our brain, it's such a complex network of relationships in our brain between these neurons firing to each other. So can we try to make something that will help us? So artificial neural networks are statistical models and mathematical models that are designed to adapt and self-program. They learn, use learning algorithms in order to understand and sort out concepts, images, and photographs. For processes to do their work, developers arrange them in layers that operate in parallel. The input layer is analogous. So the input layer is just like dendrites in the brain's neural network. The hidden layer is comparable to the cell body and sits between the input layer and the output layer, which is akin to the synaptic outputs in the brain. So this is sort of like, synaptic outputs in the brain. And the hidden layer is where artificial neurons take in a set of inputs based on synaptic weight. These all have weights assigned to them, which is the strength or connection between nodes. So the higher the weight is between these, that means that there's a stronger connection between these two neurons. That might mean that they fire together a lot, that there's just, your brain has been wired in such a way that there's stronger connections here. The hidden layer, uses synaptic weight, and these weighted inputs generate an output through a transfer function to the output layer. So this might seem complex, but I just want you to know that, this is, for sense of smell, for anything. We have a brain that is plastic. These are neurons over here that are signaling to each other. That's a concept of neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change throughout life. The human brain has an amazing ability to reorganize itself by forming new connections between brain cells, neurons. So sometimes some connections are strengthened and others are weakened as well throughout our lives. So sometimes we're most malleable when we are in childhood. So what are neural networks emulating in human brain structure, and how does training work in these artificial neural networks? So all mammalian brains, all of our brains and all of our neurons in our brain, they have interconnected neurons and transmit electrochemical signals. And again, I'll mention we have other cell types like glial, G-L-I-A-L cells that help support neurons, but neurons are like the rock stars of the brain and spinal cord and nervous system overall. Neurons have several components. The body, which is a soma, which has a nucleus and it has the dendrites here. Axons, they help connect to other cells, the axon terminals. And between two neurons, there's an axon, has a terminal here, and there's a synapse, which is a gap between two neurons. So this neuronal unit carries out communication and integration functions in the nervous system. And there are about 86 billion neurons that enable the performance of highly complex functions, like me sneezing right now. Excuse me. So the cell body, It has all those organelles. It's the cell's life support center. Dendrites, they receive the input from other cells, and the axon passes messages away from the cell body to other neurons, muscles, or glands. If it receives enough of the signal and an action potential is fired, it then sends it. Neural impulse is an electrical signal traveling down the axon. So I just want to show you. And if we receive enough of the signal, this is the resting state of a cell, a neuron, and you receive some signals from excitatory neurons, excited towards the action potential, and then there are inhibitory neurons that try to inhibit that signal. And if it receives enough of the stimulus, from the system resting state, if it doesn't receive enough, it's failed. But if it receives enough, and the soma organizes that along in the axon hillock, there is negative 55 millivolts here, then an action potential is fired. If it doesn't receive enough, then none is fired. So that's sort of what happens here. And then the action potential, if it fires, travels along the axon. And then at the end of the neuron, there are these terminal branches of axon. They form junctions with other cells. And this is also a myelin sheath, which is made up of Schwann cells in the peripheral nervous system, or oligodendrocytes in the central nervous system. It covers the axon of some neurons. It's optional, but neurons that have it, it's really good for them. It helps speed neural impulses. A lot of diseases like multiple sclerosis involve issues with the myelin sheath. And yeah, again, this is sort of like the inputs. X's would come into the dendrites. The axon is myelinated. Then they have these outputs here that are sent. If there's enough of the signal, then it's sent across this axon and then released as outputs, the next neuron. So this is just, neural networks in the brain shown real time. Again, this is just the brain. These real networks of neurons that are just so confusing to look at, but really cool. Inside the brain, you can see the signal spreading, the electrical impulse spreading. And so this is the synapse. This is the gap between these two neurons. It's between this neuron and this neuron. This is the transmitter, and then this is the receiver. In yellow is the receiver. So let me show it this way. The transmitter neuron is this, and the receiver neuron is this. It's receiving the signal. So this one is spreading the signal along here. It has these dendrites. It has the cell body, the soma. Then if it's triggered to negative 55 millivolts or above, then the action potential fires. Then it fires and then sends the signal, and then this is the axon terminal. And then along here, neurotransmitter molecules are released. They bind to the channels on this receiver neuron, and then ions flow in. And based on that, this neuron may then fire. But this is sort of like the relationship that we're showing between inputs and outputs. And then this cell is the receiver, so it receives that input. Like what I was showing over here, the inputs on the dendrites and on the outputs here. And again, this is the axon of a previous neuron. This is the synapse, the gap. And it may seem like, okay, well, what is that? The synapse is actually like between these two neurons, there's a little bit of a gap here. That's called the synapse. The synapse is the gap between the two neurons. So that's like the gap here, the synapse here, then there are the dendrites, electrical signals, and then there's another neuron here as well, dendrite of the next neuron. So axon of previous neuron, dendrites of the next neuron, and then this over here is just this neuron here. And then if it receives enough input, the dendrites bring in these inputs from this neuron and many other neurons as well. And if it reaches the threshold, it then fires this electrical signal and then releases neurotransmitters. And then those transmitters can bind to channels on this neuron here. And then this neuron has ions coming inside. If it receives enough, it fires, etc., etc. Because those ions coming in changes the membrane potential of the neuron. You see all these ions like sodium, ions, and potassium. They all make a difference. So you can see in the brain, you know, we have the brain here, we have a neural network that's actually there in biology with real life neurons that are signaling to each other here. And we can use that same idea to say, hey, we have inputs here in the dendrite, then the neuron body, which is the soma. You know, it receives all these inputs. And then if it receives enough and an action potential is fired, if it failed there, if it receives enough, then the action potential is fired. And then the signal is spread along. So we can use the same idea to then build an artificial neural network that I was showing you guys. And that's what deep learning is trying to do, to build these artificial neural networks here. And that are just based on how the brain has these connections. Dendrites, information processing, you know, information comes in, they process. And then they send this information across here. You see, guys, but this is the biological neuron. And then we can try to represent it in math and in FFX and a function as well. And then we could have these inputs coming in here from this neuron, and then we sum them up together, almost like what happens here in the real neuron. You know, you sum up this, and if it hits a threshold, you fire. You know, if it hits this from negative 70 millivolts to negative 55, if it gets the plus positive 15 millivolts relative to the outside, it fires. And similarly, that's sort of what happens here, that, you know, you have this x1 times this w1 here, plus this x2 times this w2. That's what this is. And then you put it in a non-linear element, some activation function. And then you have some output that's sent across from that neuron. So this neuron takes all these inputs and does some things to it. Similarly to how this neuron in biology does a lot of things, you know, gets a lot of these ions and everything going on from inside. And if it reaches that bar, then it fires an action potential. So that's just showing how we can go from the biology to an artificial neural network. Okay. Again, inputs come into the dendrites, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 here, this idea here. You have these outputs as well. You can represent this neuron in biology as an artificial neural network, right? So you can see all these inputs are coming in, neuron inputs, they have their weights, and you just take this weight that multiplied by whatever this value is, plus this times this, plus this times this, you know, you multiply the weights by each of the respective components. So that's a summing function. And then you have some activation function where you take those inputs and you put them together. Oh, sorry, little one. So I have a video as well on what these neural networks are learning. But I just wanted to show you that similarly, this is what, you know, we can use, and we can ultimately figure out how the human brain learns its sense of smell. That's why it's really important to learn neuroscience, or have some idea about it, to innovate in artificial intelligence. And that's sort of why all this stuff is so helpful for us to better understand how the brain works, how it signals, how it can smell. And ultimately, we can maybe make an AI that has a sense of smell. Yeah, again, this is sort of what deep learning was trying to do. You know, we have 1 million olfactory sensory neurons, 400 different types of receptors as well. And smell is a sense shared by an incredible range of living organisms and plays a critical role in how they analyze and react to the world. It's like this favorite episode that I like on YouTube with Patrick having his nose as well. I'll just share this as well. I love SpongeBob.
Sweet Neptune! Imported cheese! This is inexcusable! Yuck!
What are you doing with my cheese?
Ah! It's rotten garbage now!
So that's just, small odor molecules are the most basic building blocks of flavors and fragrances. So odor prediction is a multi-label classification problem, and they use graph neural networks as well, trying to represent odors as well, gather information from adjacent nodes and edges, update graph information with new information, transform the information. You can classify citrus, creamy, sweet, baked, spicy, odorless, vanilla, clean, alcoholic, B3, chocolate, fruity. Prepare a graph with node information, learn a new representation of nodes, reduce the graph to a vector neural network for final predictions. So, they have improved performance. Graph neural networks that use graphs based on the model of the brain. So it's very, very complex. And you can see that you could area under the receiver operator characteristic curve. These are just trying to classify these smells using some sort of a graph embedding approach as well. So there's just so many approaches out there, but I just want to show you that, you can come up with an artificial network to figure out the sense of smell. And then when you figure that out as well, you can ultimately work backwards and say, hey, once we have this AI, can we figure out more about the sense of smell and how that works? So they're feeding off of each other in a positive cycle. So the exact opposite of a vicious. Let's just use the exact antonym of that, and that's a cycle that it is, and it's for positive. So I just wanted to motivate that about artificial neural networks and the sense of smell and what that sort of means, and why biology is so important if you're interested in deep learning and innovating in this field.
So another example I want to talk to you guys about is how artificial intelligence is acquiring a sense of smell that can detect illnesses in human breath. Isn't that cool, Yankee? They can detect these illnesses. So from the breath itself, they can detect illnesses. So this is kind of how this technology can be used to help as well. So this is from Loughborough University Computer Science Department. So artificial intelligence is best known for its ability to see, as in driverless cars, and listen. Like we have OK Google, we have Amazon Alexa as well. So it's well known for those as well. I can say OK Google and my phone will respond to that, right? So, and other home assistants. From now on, it may also smell. So Andrea Soltogio is saying that they're developing an AI system that can smell human breath and learn how to identify a range of illness-revealing substances that we might breathe out. So the sense of smell is used by animals and even plants to identify hundreds of different substances that flow in the air. But compared to that of other animals, the human sense of smell is far less developed and certainly not used to carry out daily activities. Like the cat has like a better sense of smell than we do, way, way better. So for this reason, humans aren't particularly aware of the richness of information that we can send through the air, and that can be perceived by a highly sensitive olfactory system. So AI, artificial intelligence, may be about to change that. So laboratories around the world can use machines to detect very small amounts of substances in the air, like gas chromatography, mass spectrometers, or GCMS. So we can see what these look like as well. Instrumental methods of analysis.
They can analyze the air, discover thousands of different molecules like volatile organic compounds as well. Use of products and materials as well, manufacture or use of everyday products or materials. So each compound in a sample of air is first separated and then smashed up into fragments. So there's a distinct fingerprint from which compounds can be recognized. The small part of the data from an analysis of a breath sample. Okay, so each of these peaks represents a fragment of a molecule, and particular patterns of such peaks reveal the presence of distinct substances. Even the smallest peak can be crucial. So among the several hundred compounds present in the human breath, a few might reveal the presence of various cancers, even at early stages. So that has a lot of clinical impact if you can look at the breath and then analyze, if there are different types of cancers that you could have as well. Laboratories around the world are therefore experimenting with this as a non-invasive diagnostic tool to identify many illnesses painlessly and in a timely manner. So imagine you don't have to go under the needle, or you don't have to get surgery. You can just sort of figure out from these ways, but if from the sense of smell, like sometimes animals have a sixth sense, they can smell things, that we can't. And is it possible for us to improve upon our skills? So for instance, there are studies that say that, a cat's sense of smell is far more advanced than ours. When compared to humans, cats have a smelling ability that is 14 times more sensitive. So we have about 5 million olfactory receptors that detect aromas in our nose, but a cat's nose has 45 to 80 or even up to 200 million scent receptors. So from 5 up to like 200, that's like a lot, of an increase. So they have a huge, ability to smell. So make sure you're clean if you have a cat. So this can be time-consuming. Large amounts of data need to be manually inspected and analyzed by experts. That's like supervised learning as well, where you need to label that data so that artificial intelligence, deep learning network can learn those properties. So the sheer amount of compounds and the complexity of data mean that even experts take a long time to analyze a single sample, and they're prone to error as well. So because it's supervised machine learning, so one of the 3 types, there's supervised machine learning, unsupervised machine learning, and reinforcement learning. So since it's supervised, we need to label this. And experts may take a long time to analyze a single sample as well. And they can also make mistakes. They can miss a compound or mistake one compound for another. So even the training data that we use to build our models may have some flaws. But artificial intelligence nonetheless can help, take an air or breath sample, do this GCMS, do deep learning. So you can see here with deep learning, you can see these neural networks here. And then you can try to predict octanol, heptanol, benzaldehyde as well. So the data science team is trying to adapt the latest AI technology to perceive and learn a different type of data, the chemical compounds in breath samples. So again, like as I was saying that, deep learning, these are math models, are specific types of machine learning models that are based on the brain, how our neurons communicate with each other. And they're specifically engineered to read the traces left by odors. To try to figure out like what is in the air, what chemical compounds are there, can they figure out, disease status as well, or, early signs of cancer and whatnot. So you need a team of doctors, nurses, radiographers, medical physicists at Edinburgh Cancer Center to collect breath samples from participants undergoing cancer treatment. And are there particular scents that can be indicative of having cancer? Does the body emit some odors that we just can't detect? Like even for colors, we think of Roy G. Biv or Vibgyor, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. And are there other colors that we just can't perceive, than what's here on the spectrum? Like, are there other colors out there? Sometimes we don't even know what we can't even see. And some individuals are colorblind, and who's to say we're not all colorblind to some extent, but there are other colors out there that we just don't know about. So, chemists and computer scientists work on analyzing the samples. So once a number of compounds were identified manually by the chemists, fast computers were given the data to train deep learning, networks. So special devices, graphical processor units that can process multiple different pieces of information at the same time were used to really accelerate, because these models take so much data to learn. So if you want to speed this up, you need to use GPUs. And the deep learning networks learn more and more from each breath sample. So the more data, the better, until they could recognize specific patterns. So this is the goal of having a lot of data, recognize patterns that reveal specific compounds in the breath. So take air or breath samples. Then there's this GCMS, technique, that separates each compound in a sample of air into, separates it, smashes it into fragments, creates a distinct fingerprint for each of these samples. And then after that, you can find the specific compounds in the breath, and figure out what is what, then ultimately be able to recognize octanol, heptanol, like all these different, so the doctors and nurses can recognize this. So in this first study, the focus was on recognizing a group of chemicals like aldehydes that are often associated with fragrances, but also human stress conditions and illnesses. Okay, so that's so cool. Can we recognize like which people are ill despite the smells that they are emitting? That's so awesome. So computers equipped with this technology only take minutes to autonomously analyze a breath sample. And the advantage is they only take minutes to do this. But before, human expert will take lots and lots of hours to do this. So the caveat is that these AIs, to train them, you do need to have a lot of investment of time and energy in labeling all these samples, and there can still be a lot of mistakes and human error, but you do need to spend a lot of that time labeling them and giving that data. So that's like the investment, and then training the network. But once you have, and this could take a human expert hours to label, but we want them to label as much data as possible. Once we give it to the deep learning model, then they can analyze a breath sample within just minutes instead of just taking hours. So AI is making the whole process cheaper and making it more reliable. So because, it's a machine, it's going to give the same, it's like a machine computational model that's always going to give the same results, across, if the conditions are the same, it's going to give that results reliably. Whereas there could be human error if we, continue using humans to break apart these samples and recognize them. And this intelligent software acquires knowledge and improves over time as it analyzes more samples. And why is that the case? Because it's having a continuously growing pile of data. So the more the data, the better the algorithm becomes. So if you want to buy a self-driving car today, I might say that, maybe wait for a few years till wait till the technology gets better and better. But, more power to you if you want to buy it today, that's awesome. But yeah, sometimes just wait, because these technologies get better over time as more and more data is collected. So that's how AI continuously learns, just like we learn about people in our lives, things, and so on. The more we do something, the more we learn about it. And we get better and better at something over time. So that's why it's like artificial intelligence. It's like getting better with more data, with more experience over time. This method is not restricted to any particular substance. So deep learning systems, again, based on the model of the brain, the computational models, neurons firing to other neurons, they can be trained to detect small amounts of volatile compounds with potentially very explosive, with potentially wide applications in medicine, forensics, environmental analysis, and others. So if an AI system can detect markers of disease, then this becomes possible way to diagnose whether we are ill or not. It has great potential, but also could choose to be, controversial. There's always things that can be used for good and for evil. Imagine if we have this AI and we can just smell people and we can figure out their private information about their health status when they don't want us to figure it out, when it's personal, so that could be used for evil too. So there's good and bad, and that's why it's controversial. So we simply suggest that artificial intelligence could be used as a tool to detect substances in the air. So as I was mentioning, there's so many applications, and it can also AI to build models on the human brain olfactory system can also help us understand our own brain as well. So it's a positive feedback loop. I finally figured out the term. So, you can develop artificial intelligence to understand smells And you can also develop our understanding of the brain's olfactory smell system. So you can kind of both feed off of each other in a positive feedback loop. You know, one gets better, the other one will get better too. So it doesn't have to, this approach doesn't just have to diagnose and make a decision. And the final conclusions and decisions are left to us. So this approach just says that, hey, we can just make an artificial intelligence model that can take an air or breath sample and help predict what is in it. You know, try to predict what are the substances in that air. And then whatever we use it for, whether for medical uses or other uses, it is up to us, but the technology will be there and we will be praying and hoping that it goes in the right hands for greater good. So I just sort of wanted to just tie in everything together to kind of show you how this artificial intelligence that's trying to understand how the human brain smells and trying to come up with that technique, how that will be so valuable for us so that we can advance not only our understanding of artificial intelligence to predict those tasks, but improve our understanding of how our human brain smells as well. And also maybe use this AI for additional applications to help save lives, improve lives, make lives easier, and just do great things in general. So thank you for watching. So thank you guys. And if you like this talk, please subscribe to my channel. And I'm Saniya, and that's cute little me, little sister. And 1 second, I'll just show you little Tubby. And this is cute little Tubby as well. And we just want to say thank you for watching this.